He thought mocking a passenger would make him powerful. He didn't realize the man in that seat built the company that owned their airline contract. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on a uniform. A flight attendant tried to humiliate a black CEO in front of the entire cabin. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. What happened next stunned everyone on board. The boarding pass stopped mid-air. Callan Dre held it loosely between two fingers, arm extended, the terminal's filtered light casting a faint gold sheen across the plastic. The air was cool inside Halveth International, but a strange heat prickled beneath his collar. Rhett Hadron, the gate attendant, didn't take the pass immediately. Instead, he stared at it. No, at him, with a pause just long enough to register. The man was thin, angular, and wore a uniform that looked one wash away from threadbare. His name badge gleamed dully under the late afternoon sun spilling through the terminal's vaulted glass. Then Rhett's lips curled, not in welcome, but in something resembling triumph, masked as courtesy. "Special treatment for the boss class, huh?" he muttered, just loud enough to be heard, just soft enough to be deniable. Callan blinked once. The words slid under his skin like a splinter. Still, he kept his expression neutral, replying with a polite nod and the faintest twitch of a smile. "Just heading home," he said quietly, stepping past the gate and into the jet bridge. But something had shifted. He didn't know what it was yet, only that it had begun. Inside the jet, the first-class cabin was quiet and immaculately arranged, leather seats gleaming under recessed lighting. Callan took seat 1A, placed his briefcase beneath the polished console, and slowly exhaled. The tension from a week of intense negotiations still clung to him like smoke. His company, Varentech Industries, had just finalized a tentative agreement with a government task force on clean propulsion for military cargo carriers, a massive step toward ethical aerospace reform. It should have been a moment of relief, rest, pride. But Rhett's eyes had followed him into the cabin. Even without looking back, Callan could feel the weight of them. His mind spun with the memory of the boarding exchange, the way Rhett lingered over the barcode, the tone, the emphasis, boss class. It wasn't simple sarcasm. It carried a weight that hinted at knowledge, personal knowledge. Across the aisle, a man in a tan coat sat down, stocky build, thick wrists, and a clean-shaven face that held a permanent smirk. Their eyes met briefly. The man nodded as if greeting an old acquaintance, though Callan didn't know him. Then, curiously, the man looked toward the galley where Rhett was preparing pre-departure checks and subtly raised a brow. Rhett responded with a barely there tilt of his head. That was when Callan knew. This wasn't just travel. It was a stage. The engines whirred to life beneath the floor. Callan leaned his head back against the seat and let the gentle vibration of the cabin fill the silence. But the quiet didn't calm him. It amplified everything else. The faint static in the intercom, the unnatural delay before the doors closed, the fact that Rhett hadn't yet made the usual welcome announcement. He opened his tablet, scanning through final reports for Project Auric, Varentech's crown jewel, a self-regenerating propulsion system that promised high-altitude efficiency with zero emissions. Classified, encrypted, and stored locally. But as he scrolled through the figures, he paused. There was nothing wrong with the data, but his focus blurred. His instincts, those same instincts that helped him turn a startup into a government partner, were screaming now. Rhett finally passed through the cabin, adjusting tray tables. He stopped near Callan, brushing a hand along the seat divider a little too long. "Let me know if you need anything, sir," he said, voice laced with artificial cheer. "We aim to please, especially the important ones." Callan didn't reply. Instead, he studied Rhett's face. Thin lips, clean shave, a narrow scar near the ear. It wasn't the kind of face you'd remember from a flight. It was the kind you'd recognize from something else. But what? As the plane taxied, the cabin lights dimmed to a low glow. Callan's gaze drifted to the window. The sun outside hung low, gilding the tarmac with streaks of orange and gold. Shadows stretched long across the ground, bending slightly with the movement of the aircraft. Behind him, Rhett's footsteps retreated, echoing faintly down the aisle. Yet Callan didn't feel alone. He flexed his fingers once, rolled his jaw slowly, and looked down at his tablet. Then he looked at the seat in front of him. There, just barely visible in the plastic molding of the tray table hinge, was a thin scratch, almost like a tool had been wedged in and withdrawn. Out of place. Mechanical. Intentional. Callan's thoughts turned darker. What if he wasn't just being targeted for discomfort? What if the hostility wasn't personal, but professional? Rhett passed by again, this time saying nothing. His eyes, however, flicked briefly to Callan's jacket pocket, then to the folder marked Auric. He smiled faintly, too faintly, and moved on. Callan's throat tightened. He didn't yet know what was coming, or who Rhett Hadron really was beyond the name on the badge. But something had boarded that plane with him, something disguised in smirks and silence, something rehearsed. His first instinct was to file it away, dismiss it, wait until landing. But experience had taught him something else. Paranoia in the skies wasn't weakness. It was survival. As the jet lifted from the runway, streaks of sunlight danced across the window, and Callan's reflection flickered in the glass, tired, wary, and already bracing for whatever came next. Sometimes, he thought, the quietest flights carry the loudest storms. Not on my list, Rhett said curtly, setting the meal tray down with a metallic clatter that echoed louder than it should have in the hushed cabin. He didn't glance at Callan as he spoke, his tone as casual as a shrug, but his words struck like a needle. Callan looked down at the tray. Every first-class passenger around him had a warm entree, glass of wine, and folded cloth napkin arranged neatly on their polished trays. Except C81A, his seat. The silver plate in front of him was empty except for a single, sealed cup of water. He raised his eyes slowly. Rhett was already turning the cart away, his hands moving stiffly, jaw tight. "Guess your company forgot you," Rhett added, loud enough to catch the attention of the passenger across the aisle. Grant Maller chuckled under his breath, the sound low and smug, like someone watching a joke unfold exactly as planned. He didn't bother hiding his smirk. Callan felt Maller's eyes lingering just a bit too long, measuring his reaction. Callan shifted his posture, straightened his tie, and nodded once, calmly. "It's fine," he said quietly. His voice was level, controlled, but inside, something had tilted. This wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't an accident. This was personal. He reached for the folder tucked into the side compartment of his seat. Thick pages marked Project Auric, Phase 2, filled with confidential schematics and funding breakdowns for next-generation propulsion systems. It had taken 2 years of coordination with federal engineers to get to this point. And now, mid-flight, he was being singled out, without reason, but not without purpose. Across the aisle, Maller sipped from his wine glass, watching him with the quiet glee of someone who knew the ending to a story no one else had read. Callan turned to the window, feigning indifference, but his mind raced. Rhett's earlier announcement had been off. "Please fasten your masks for a short turbulence window," he'd said with artificial cheer. Yet the air had been smooth. Not a single bump, not a jolt. Why lie about turbulence unless it served another purpose? He remembered Rhett's smile at the gate, how it had curled just a second too long. The way he'd scanned the boarding pass twice, fingers tapping slowly across the screen as if waiting for a prompt. And now, the forgotten meal. None of it felt random. Each piece was building towards something. Callan turned his attention back to his tablet, trying to review a schematic, but the words blurred. A rising awareness bloomed inside him. Not panic, but the familiar pull of instinct honed over years of negotiation and boardroom chess games. Someone on this plane knew who he was. Not in the surface-level, press-release sense, but deeply, intimately, enough to attack with subtlety first. He adjusted the brightness on his screen. The reflection in the glass window gave him a partial view of the cabin behind him. He saw Rhett 2 rows back, whispering to the other crew member, then glancing quickly in Callan's direction. When their eyes met in the reflection, Rhett looked away too fast. Callan's breath slowed. His training from years at Varentech kicked in. Calm under pressure, clarity in confusion. He touched the corner of the folder, subtly checking the flap that held his security token, a slim, encrypted chip no larger than a fingernail, embedded with project files. Still there, still intact. Let them keep watching, he thought. Let them think I'm unaware. But now, even the silence felt staged. Maller shifted again, this time leaning forward to press his service button. Rhett approached promptly, their exchange brief but too low to hear. Yet Callan saw Maller slide something under the napkin on his tray just for a second before Rhett scooped it up and walked away. Callan's fingers curled slightly around the edge of his folder. 2 men, he thought, not strangers. Coordinated. And then he noticed the small detail that pulled everything together. Maller's boarding tag, still tucked into the back pocket of the seat in front of him. Standard economy class. So how did he end up across from Callan in first class? Callan's eyes narrowed. This flight, this arrangement, none of it was chance. It was built, layered, structured with the same precision his engineers used to build wing systems. A plan was in motion, and he was the target. But why? He closed the folder slowly, locking it shut with a magnetic click. Whatever was coming, it wasn't finished yet. But one thing was now certain. This flight was no longer about travel. It was about survival. Somewhere beneath the attendant's grin was knowledge he shouldn't have had. He knows something about me, Callan thought. But from where? Callan barely registered the blur of movement before pain exploded in his mouth. The metal hook jabbed violently between his lips, scraping against the inside of his cheek with brutal force. A flash of copper burst across his tongue, the unmistakable taste of blood. The sharp edge of the hanger lodged against the soft flesh behind his teeth, forcing his jaw painfully open. His vision narrowed. The cold gleam of the twisted wire shimmered inches from his eye. Rhett Hadron's face hovered inches away, flushed with a sick, triumphant rage. "Need something to hang that fancy jacket, sir?" he repeated, his voice mocking and breath sour. His wrist twisted slightly, pressing the metal deeper, angling it toward the roof of Callan's mouth. A dry chuckle came from across the aisle. Grant Maller leaned forward in his seat, elbows on knees, grinning with wolfish glee. "Teach him his place," he muttered under his breath, not loud enough for the entire cabin, but perfectly audible to Callan. The moment snapped. Callan didn't think, he moved. His right hand shot up, fingers clamping around Rhett's wrist with startling force. The attendant flinched, surprised by the speed of the reaction. Callan's left hand reached across, closing around the hanger's base where it jutted from his lips. In one fluid motion he wrenched it free, pain blooming anew as the metal tore from his mouth with a sickening scrape. Then, pivoting his wrist with precise control, he reversed the angle and drove the curved hook under Rhett's jaw. The wire bit into flesh, lodging along the tender underside near the throat. Rhett gasped, body jerking as he tried to recoil, but Callan held firm. The hanger, still warm from contact, trembled slightly in his grip as he tightened his hold. A thin line of blood traced down Rhett's neck, the pressure of the metal just enough to pierce skin without severing. "Move again," Callan said in a low, ice-flat voice, "and I'll make sure you remember where this came from." The silence that followed was total. The entire cabin had frozen. Passengers stared, eyes wide, mouths open, hands hovering mid-motion. A flight attendant in the economy section had stopped mid-pour, the plastic cup trembling in his grip. Even the ambient buzz of the engine seemed suddenly muted beneath the weight of the moment. Rhett's breathing turned shallow, chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked bursts. His eyes, once full of disdain, now flickered with uncertainty. He glanced toward Maller, but the man across the aisle had gone stiff. The smirk wiped clean from his face. "Let go," Rhett whispered hoarsely, his voice tight with pain and disbelief. "You can't." "I just did," Kalen interrupted, his gaze burning with a fury so measured it was more terrifying than a shout. He leaned closer, speaking only loud enough for Rhett to hear. "You want to see what else I'm capable of?" For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Callan released his grip on the hanger. Rhett stumbled back 2 steps, one hand flying to his throat, blood smearing across his knuckles. His other hand still dangled uselessly, the nerves in his wrist likely shocked from Callan's iron grasp. His mouth opened to speak, but no words came. Just a breathless rasp. Callan stood, his knees steady despite the throb in his jaw. The pain was a dull roar now, each heartbeat echoing through the wound inside his cheek. But it was a distant concern. His mind was clear, focused. He turned, scanning the cabin. No one spoke, no one moved. Passengers avoided his gaze, but many had seen. Callan knew it. They weren't allies, not yet, but they weren't blind either. The image of a crew member jamming metal into a passenger's mouth was burned into every pair of watching eyes. A bead of sweat rolled down Maller's temple. He shifted in his seat but said nothing. Callan bent slightly, retrieved the hanger now slick with blood and saliva, and wrapped it carefully in a paper napkin from his tray table. His fingers worked with calm precision, folding the cloth neatly like a surgeon storing a scalpel. He slipped the bundle into his inner jacket pocket, never breaking eye contact with Rhett. "You just weaponized the wrong thing," Callan whispered, and then he sat down. The hum of the engines returned, steady and indifferent, as if nothing had happened at all. But in the stillness that followed, Callan knew the dynamic of the flight had shifted. The line between passenger and victim had blurred, and what remained in its place was something far less predictable. The line between restraint and retribution, Callan realized, is thinner than steel. The coat hanger slipped from Rhett's jaw as he stumbled backward, a thin line of blood glistening on his neck like a crack in glass. The cabin didn't erupt into screams, but something worse happened. Silence. A breathless, stunned silence that made the dull roar of the engine seem louder, more menacing. Callan Dray, still seated, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline. Across from him, Grant Maller shot up from his seat, voice raised in practiced outrage. "He attacked a crew member," Maller shouted, pointing toward Callan with theatrical disgust. "That man just assaulted flight staff." His words cracked the silence, drawing gasps and scattered murmurs from nearby passengers. Some turned to look, confused. Others had seen enough to know Maller wasn't telling the whole story. A young man in a business jacket leaned toward the aisle, whispering to another. "Didn't the attendant lunge first?" His companion gave a slow nod, eyes locked on Rhett. Rhett clutched his throat, breathing hard. His uniform was slightly torn, the collar twisted where Callan had grabbed him. Despite the blood, he was still trying to command the space, his voice sharp but ragged. "You'll regret touching me," he spat, his eyes wild with something deeper than pain. Panic. "You think your title matters up here?" Callan rose from his seat slowly, steadying himself. The inside of his cheek stung where the hanger had pierced, but he forced his voice to remain even. "I don't use my title to survive," he said, his eyes locked on Rhett's. He reached up and pressed the call button. The chime echoed through the cabin, followed by a long pause. Then, instead of flight security, a man in a navy vest approached briskly from the front, Crew Chief Darren Cale. Cale was in his early 50s, built like an aging oak, solid, no nonsense. He scanned the tense scene with the eyes of someone who'd seen his share of in-flight emergencies. But what he saw now was different. His gaze dropped to the hanger on the floor, bent, wet with blood and saliva, and something shifted behind his eyes. "Rhett," Cale said quietly, stepping between the men. "What have you done?" Rhett didn't respond. His breathing quickened as he looked past Cale, not at Callan, but at Malor. A flicker passed between them. Malor gave a small, imperceptible nod. Callan saw it. So did Cale. Callan narrowed his eyes. That look wasn't random. It wasn't shock or confusion. It was coordination. They know each other, Callan realized, and they expected this. Cale looked from Rhett to Malor, his expression hardening. "Everyone, back in your seats," he instructed the cabin. "Now." Passengers obeyed, though many kept their eyes fixed on the confrontation. Callan remained standing. Cale turned to him next, voice low. "You injured?" "I'll live," Callan replied. Cale knelt and picked up the twisted hanger with a handkerchief. His brow furrowed as he examined the crude weapon, lips tightening. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered. The intercom crackled suddenly. "Crew, Chief Cale, report status. I repeat, report cabin status," came the captain's voice, laced with tension. Cale stepped to the panel near the galley and pressed the mic. "Situation contained for now," he said. "2 individuals involved, 1 crew, 1 passenger. We'll need a full debrief on landing." The response was firm. "Until then, they both sit." "No exceptions." Cale glanced at Callan. "That includes you." Callan nodded, unbuttoned his jacket, and returned to his seat. He sat upright, unflinching, while Rhett stood frozen near the galley, cradling his jaw. Malor, meanwhile, had sunk back into his chair but no longer wore his smirk. Instead, he stared out the window, jaw clenched. But Callan kept his gaze on the reflection in the gloss of the cabin wall. He saw Malor's fingers twitch once, then again. A signal. This was never about humiliation, Callan thought. This was orchestration. Cale returned to the aisle, his steps slower now. He paused beside Callan, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I've got questions." "So will the pilot. But right now, keep your head down. Let me figure out what we're really flying into." Callan gave a subtle nod. His fingers brushed against the edge of the napkin in his lap, the one he had used to clean the blood from his face. Tucked inside it now was the hanger. It wasn't just a weapon. It was evidence. Malor shifted again, this time adjusting his cufflink. It glinted oddly under the cabin light, too reflective for gold, too mechanical for fashion. Callan didn't look away, even as the tension in the cabin tried to drag him under. He had felt this kind of pressure before, behind closed doors in military briefings, during contract negotiations that would tilt global power structures. But never 30,000 feet in the air, bruised and bleeding, surrounded by strangers who weren't sure if he was the villain or the victim. Still, he stayed calm, because something bigger than bruised pride or corporate envy was unraveling around him. There were strings being pulled, and at the other end of those strings, men like Malor, like Rhett, like whoever had whispered Callan's name with enough venom to send a hanger as their message. The flight droned on. Outside the window, clouds rolled by like silent witnesses. Inside, the mood settled into a low, humming distrust. Passengers glanced from face to face as though waiting for someone to make the next move. Cale returned to his post but kept casting glances down the aisle. Rhett refused to sit, swaying slightly with each turn of the jet's path, holding a compress to his jaw but saying nothing more. Malor kept staring ahead, but the reflection in the glass wall betrayed the tick in his jaw. And Callan? Callan leaned back, pressing his bruised shoulder against the seat. The pain grounded him. The silence empowered him. The captain's voice returned once more, colder this time. "Chief Cale, I repeat, both parties remain seated until landing. No exceptions." Cale's reply was quiet but firm. "Understood." Callan closed his eyes briefly, let out a slow breath, then opened them again. "I can sit," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone else, "but truth doesn't." Callan's jaw throbbed with a steady, pulsing ache, but his thoughts were sharper than ever. Blood had dried along the corner of his mouth, a crusted reminder of the violence he had just endured. He sat rigid in seat 1A, his back straight, hands folded calmly in his lap, but inside, a storm brewed. He replayed Rhett's earlier words again. "Guess your company forgot you." The phrasing echoed, louder with each passing moment. It wasn't just a cruel taunt, it was too specific. Crew members didn't know the names of private defense firms, especially ones like Verintech that operated behind heavy government firewalls. And no ordinary flight attendant would drop that kind of line unless someone had told him. Someone inside. Across the aisle, Grant Maller shifted in his seat. Sweat darkened the underarms of his tailored shirt despite the cabin's cool air. His eyes flicked up to the seatbelt light as if expecting turbulence that never came. Callan tilted his head slightly, watching him without turning fully. There was a nervousness in Maller's movements now, a rigidity in his posture that hadn't been there earlier. The smugness was gone, replaced by the kind of stillness that came from fear of exposure. Then Callan saw it. In the reflection of the cabin window, distorted slightly by the curve of the glass, a small glint caught the light, a flash of metallic silver tucked into Maller's cufflink. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but as Maller adjusted his sleeve, Callan recognized the gleam for what it truly was. A transmitter. Compact, surgical, military grade. His breath caught for half a second. This wasn't just about a disgruntled crew member going too far. This flight was under surveillance. He was under surveillance. A surveillance op on a commercial aircraft? Under federal airspace? The realization was a blade to the spine. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't even about revenge. This was about information extraction. Callan's mind shifted instantly into crisis mode. If Maller was transmitting live data, what had he already seen? He remembered reviewing the Project Auric folder earlier in the flight. Even encrypted, optical relays could capture flashes of screens, password inputs, structural diagrams. He had to move, quietly, precisely. Keeping his expression neutral, Callan reached down and carefully retrieved the crumpled napkin on his tray table. Nestled inside, hidden beneath the folds, was the twisted metal hanger Rhett had used to assault him. Callan hadn't touched the hook since twisting it under Rhett's jaw. Its curve now bore not just dried blood and saliva, but fingerprints. His and Rhett's. Evidence. He folded the napkin slowly, pressing the ends together like he was wiping his mouth. To anyone watching, it would appear unremarkable. Chief Darren Cale returned just then, approaching with a white plastic box of first aid supplies. The man's face was lined with concern and conflict. He hadn't spoken much since the incident, and Callan sensed he was still trying to figure out whom to believe. "I'm fine," Callan said quietly, accepting a cotton swab but not using it. Then, in a voice meant only for Cale's ears, he added, "Check the manifest again." Cale hesitated. "Why?" "You'll find an extra boarding tag under Grant Maller's name," Callan said, his tone even. "Secondary clearance, probably a dummy alias, maybe even a federal override. But it's there." Cale frowned. "That's a serious accusation." "So was jamming a hanger into my mouth," Callan replied flatly. "But this isn't just assault." "It's something bigger." Cale didn't speak again. He nodded once, turned, and walked briskly toward the crew terminal. Callan turned his gaze back toward Maller just in time to see the man reach into his pocket, then freeze. Maller's fingers fumbled frantically as he patted himself down, searching. The tension in his face shifted from worry to alarm. His lips parted slightly and his throat bobbed with a nervous swallow. He realized it. The boarding pass was gone. Callan didn't move. He didn't need to. The message had been sent. 30 seconds later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through, tense but professional. "Due to a medical alert reported by the cabin crew, we are initiating a precautionary descent protocol. We'll be diverting shortly to Rievemont Airfield for further inspection." A beat of silence. Then came the murmur of confusion from passengers behind them. Seatbelt buckles clinked as a few leaned toward windows, whispering to one another. Callan didn't react. He felt the change in the plane's angle, a soft, downward tilt. The engines shifted pitch, almost unnoticeable to the untrained ear, but he caught it. They were descending. Maller's knuckles had gone pale from gripping his armrest. Callan turned slightly, watching him with the calm of a surgeon preparing for a precise incision. "You feeling all right, Grant?" Maller's lips pressed into a tight line. "Sometimes people get sick when they realize they're not the ones in control," Callan continued, voice quiet but sharp. Maller's head snapped toward him. "You think you're winning?" "No," Callan said. "I think you're losing track of how quickly lies fall apart under pressure." Maller leaned in, teeth clenched. "You don't understand what you've walked into." "No," Callan whispered back, "but you're about to explain it." "Just not to me." The intercom buzzed again. Cale's voice this time, low and direct. "Cabin crew, prepare for protocol red on touchdown. Secure aisle access." Mallore's breathing grew shallow. Sweat now beaded on his forehead in thick droplets. Callan leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose. He glanced once more at the twisted hanger in the napkin beside him. Still hidden. Still holding the truth. The plane angled slightly again, its descent more pronounced now. The windows outside revealed streaks of light. Dawn breaking, but not gently. The kind of light that exposed things long buried in shadows. Callan closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself. Sometimes, he thought as Maller's panic began to bloom fully beside him, justice flies on the same wind as fear. The sharp chime of the captain's intercom sliced through the growing tension. "This is your captain speaking. We've received a report of a potential medical emergency on board. As a precaution, we'll be diverting to Rievemont Airfield. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." The announcement sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Passengers looked around, murmurs rising like a tide, some craning their necks to see if anyone had collapsed. But no one had. There was no sick passenger, no visible crisis, only the subtle shift in altitude and the ominous change in direction. Callan Dre did not move. He sat still in seat 1A, a faint sting in his jaw where blood dried against his skin, and his eyes trained on the reflection in the window beside him. Grant Maller, 2 rows behind, was rising slowly to his feet. "He's not a victim," Maller suddenly shouted, his voice jagged and hoarse. "He's a plant." Heads turned. The already anxious passengers fell silent, the hum of the engines now the only steady sound. A man across the aisle blinked in confusion. A young father clutched his toddler closer. Everyone was watching. Callan turned slightly, just enough to make eye contact with Maller without shifting his body. "A plant?" he said, his voice calm, even curious. But the word sent a jolt through him. That wasn't random. That word carried weight, operational weight. It was a term used in covert protocol, in planned extractions, in setups meant to discredit or destabilize. His instincts surged. Maller pointed a trembling finger toward Callan, but there was hesitation now, as if the outburst had gone further than he intended. "He's not who he says he is," Maller continued, the volume dropping but the venom still present. "You think this is some corporate brawl? He's defense intel. Embedded. A ghost in a suit." Across the aisle, flight attendant Rhett Hadron, his collar rumpled, his jaw bruised, stood frozen. In his right hand, he still clutched the twisted coat hanger, fingers trembling slightly as if unsure whether to drop it or raise it again. Callan stood now, slowly, carefully. He adjusted his slate-blue tie with quiet precision, his eyes never leaving Maller. Blood stained the lower edge of his collar, a crimson blot against pale fabric, but his voice, when it came, was like cold steel. "Let me guess," he said, stepping into the aisle. "You're not traveling for pleasure." Maller's jaw tightened, his hands dropped to his sides, curling into fists. You think we didn't know who funds your research? Maller replied. His tone was lower now, for Callan's ears only. Varentech's clean energy engines. That's just branding, right? You've been building systems for missile-class aircraft, fusion-based rotation cores, flight-stable magnetic compression. You think that's clean energy? The words struck like shrapnel. Callan didn't flinch, but inside, something shifted. The details Maller listed, those weren't available to the public, not even to mid-level staff. He had heard that kind of specificity only in Level 5 clearance meetings. That meant someone had spoken, someone high, someone inside. His mind raced even as he kept his expression impassive. You're quoting internal specs, Callan said slowly. Specifications only disclosed during secure briefings. Maller gave a crooked smile, just shy of triumphant. Yeah, strange, right? Behind them, Rhett gave a sudden twitch, his hand shifting slightly on the hanger. Callan's gaze snapped to him. That movement wasn't fear. It was recognition. Rhett wasn't simply a pawn. He was aware of the plan's intent. You weren't supposed to survive the flight, Callan murmured, the realization settling like frost. Maller stepped closer, his voice lower still. It's nothing personal. You just knew too much. And that turbulence warning? He flicked his eyes to Rhett. That was our window. A beat of silence passed. Rhett shifted uncomfortably. His lips parted slightly. His eyes, glassy with guilt, met Callan's. It was supposed to be clean, he mumbled. Callan took a slow breath. The air around him felt charged, like the pressure before a storm's first crack. He understood now. The meal denial, the hangar, the remark at the gate. It had all been groundwork, not random acts of bitterness, but a rehearsed routine designed to provoke, to create a believable escalation. They had tried to manufacture cause for restraint, then engineer the moment of failure. Make him lash out, make him snap, frame it as arrogance, paint it as aggression, end it in turbulence. But they hadn't expected restraint. They hadn't expected a counter. And if I had reacted the way you wanted, Callan said softly, I'd be the one in cuffs by now. Or a sealed report. Maller's jaw worked silently for a second before he muttered, You're lucky we didn't use something sharper. The cabin had grown quieter still. Even those not privy to the details felt the danger in the air. The subtle tilt of the aircraft signaled descent. Outside the windows, the landscape was changing, coastal terrain flattening into restricted corridors. The plane was dropping toward Rievemont. Callan turned away from Malor, walking slowly down the aisle toward Chief Kale, who had reappeared from the cockpit stairwell with his brow furrowed. Callan said nothing at first. He only nodded once, calm, deliberate. Kale gave the faintest nod in return. The trap was closing, but not the one Maller had expected. Behind him, Callan heard Maller speak again, low and bitter. You weren't supposed to land alive. Callan paused, halfway down the aisle. He turned his head just enough for his voice to carry. Not today, he replied, voice low as steel. The plane's wheels screeched as they met the tarmac, the sudden jolt rolling through the cabin like a shockwave. Callan braced himself as the aircraft slowed, glancing out the small oval window to see emergency lights pulsing in the gray dawn. The Rievemont airfield wasn't a civilian hub. It was used for federal defense tests, which meant security here followed different rules that could either protect him or bury him. As the engines powered down with a long, rattling hum, the cabin filled with murmurs and unease. People clutched their armrests, their carry-ons, their breath. The flight crew stood stiffly near the galley, faces pale. Callan sat motionless, his injured mouth still throbbing from the hangar wound, but his eyes locked on the front of the aircraft. Then came the metallic clack of the cabin door unlocking. 2 armed air marshals stepped inside with mechanical precision, dressed in black uniforms with no insignia but their presence alone announcing authority. Their boots thudded heavily against the floor as they moved past stunned passengers, scanning faces until they reached the first-class section. Callan felt a cold certainty rise in his chest. One of them stopped directly in front of him, hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. The other held out a data slate. "Mr. Callan Dre?" the taller officer asked sharply. Callan nodded, his voice steady despite the tension. "That's correct. You are under temporary detention pending inquiry for assault on a federal flight crew member. Please stand and keep your hands visible." A rustle swept through the cabin. Callan didn't move yet. He didn't blink. From the corner of his vision, he caught Rhett's smirk, a subtle twitch at the edge of his bloodied mouth. A flicker of victory. Across the aisle, Grant Maller sat upright now, expression unreadable, hands folded, sweat glistening just beneath his collar. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't worried either. This had been part of the plan. A setup from the moment Callan had handed over his boarding pass. "This is a mistake," Callan said calmly, raising both hands slightly. "I was assaulted." "There are witnesses." Before the officers could respond, a gravelly voice cut through the tension. "Hold on." All eyes turned to the rear galley. Chief Crew Officer Darren Cale stepped forward, holding a sealed aluminum meal tray in both hands. His brow was tense, voice low but forceful. "I need to show you something," Cale said, addressing the marshals as he approached. He set the tray down on the nearest seat and flipped the lid. Inside, nestled among napkins and plastic cutlery, lay a pair of silver cufflinks, now cracked open to reveal the delicate gleam of miniature audio chips. One of the marshals leaned closer, frowning. "What is this?" "Proof," Cale replied. "These were hidden on Grant Maller. The chips are wired for close-range transmission, most likely used to intercept data from Mr. Dre's documents. He planted these during the flight. Maller's eyes flared for a split second. "That's absurd," he snapped. "He's lying to protect his boss." "I'm not protecting anyone," Cale said. "I saw your movements. I saw how Rhett acted. This wasn't a normal flight. You used crew access to smuggle in surveillance tools." The marshals exchanged glances. One reached for the audio chip, pressing a recessed node. Static crackled, followed by a muffled but unmistakable whisper. "Use the hangar, if he resists." Rhett's voice. The silence that followed was suffocating. Callan's heart pounded in his ears, but his expression didn't change. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realization dawning in their eyes. The shorter marshal straightened, his hand now far from his weapon. "This changes the situation." "You think?" Cale muttered, arms crossed tightly. Maller bolted. In one fluid motion, he leapt from his seat and shoved the tray aside, sprinting for the rear galley. But he didn't make it past the second row. One of the marshals reacted fast, quicker than Callan expected. In a single, practiced motion, the officer caught Maller by the neck and shoulder, twisting him down into the aisle with a hard grunt. "Stay down," the officer growled, pressing a knee into Maller's spine. Callan stood slowly, the tension still trembling in his limbs. He ran a hand across his mouth, feeling the dried blood and swelling beneath his fingertips. Chief Cale stepped beside him, nodding once. "You were right," Cale said, voice low and rough with restrained anger. "This wasn't a service incident. It was a hit job." Callan exhaled through his nose, steady now, as Maller grunted under the officer's grip. He looked down, then toward the open cabin door where gray light spilled across the threshold. His voice was quiet but resolute. "Funny," Callan murmured, "how truth lands smoother than any plane." He snapped orders and crossed the line with insults, thinking the cameras wouldn't catch him. If you believe arrogance always meets its mirror, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't need violence, it needs truth. The metal door shut behind Callan with a heavy, final clang. Inside Rivemont's debriefing hall, the air was sharp with the scent of static and recycled air, and the low hum of security systems buzzed faintly through the walls. The room was stark. No decorations, no comfort, just cold steel, fluorescent lights, and a long table lined with cables and recording devices. Callan sat with his back straight, though his jaw still throbbed from Rhett's assault. His slate blue suit, now wrinkled and stained faintly at the collar with dried blood, seemed out of place in the sterile room. But there was no time to think about appearance. He knew why he was here. Across from him sat two men, Agent Riven Tarl and Investigator Leon Marich. Tarl, tall and lean with a sharp widow's peak, flipped open a secured case containing a data packet, his gloved hands moving with practiced economy. Marich, broader, quieter, and older, stared at Callan with eyes like gunmetal, calculating, steady, and emotionless. "You understand," Tarl began, his voice clipped like a man trained to shave words to the bone, "that your company's research files were intercepted mid-flight. We need to know exactly what they were targeting." Callan didn't flinch. "Auric drive prototypes," he replied, voice flat but firm. "Power-efficient propulsion units designed to reduce fuel consumption in high-altitude deployment." Merrick arched a brow. "Encrypted?" "By me, personally," Callan confirmed. Tarl didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the answer. Instead, he tapped a folder on the table. "Encrypted by the same man your attacker said was the real obstacle." Callan's brow furrowed. The words hit like a puzzle piece snapping into place. So, that was it. The hangar, the humiliation. It hadn't been about personal rage or even corporate intimidation. It had been a calculated distraction, a performance designed to rattle him, to break his focus, just long enough for Maller's micro-devices to do their work. "They were after the tablet," Callan said aloud, more to himself than to them. Tarl and Marich exchanged a glance. Callan leaned back, breathing in through his nose. "The hangar wasn't the point. It was the smokescreen. While Rhett kept me pinned, Maller's cufflinks were scanning my screen, capturing optical data. Which means the plan only failed," Marich added coolly, "because Rhett lost control earlier than he was supposed to." Callan didn't answer. His thoughts were already turning. Something about the entire assault had felt off, uncalculated, desperate. Rhett's face during the attack hadn't been cold and confident. It had cracked with panic, as if the timeline had slipped. He rubbed his jaw slowly. "I want to speak to Rhett." Tarl frowned. "We're not in the business of personal confrontations." "This isn't personal," Callan said. "It's necessary." Marich gave a slight nod. "Under observation." A few minutes later, the adjoining door clicked open, and Callan stepped into a smaller, equally stark room. A single glass panel ran along one wall, a one-way mirror that stared directly into the larger interrogation chamber. Behind it, he knew Tarl and Marich were watching. Rhett Hadron sat at the metal table, his wrists loosely cuffed, a white bandage slashed across his left cheekbone. His flight attendant uniform had been stripped down to a thermal shirt and prison-issued slacks. He looked more like a man who had run out of script than a willing conspirator. Callan stood across the table and lowered himself slowly into the chair. He didn't speak for a moment. He simply looked at Rhett, letting the silence settle heavy between them. "You could have killed me," he said softly, each word weighed and placed with care. Rhett's eyes flickered. For a moment, something human passed over his face, guilt or maybe shame, but it vanished quickly, replaced by that old mask of defiance. That wasn't the plan. Then what was? Rhett hesitated. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "They said, if you were scared enough, you'd hand over the files without a fight. You'd fold." Callan's voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "And who's they?" The silence stretched again. Rhett looked down at his fingers, the skin around his knuckles still red and raw. The light buzzed overhead like a warning. "I don't know names," he muttered. "You knew enough to target me. You knew about Auric, about Varentech. That kind of intel doesn't fall out of a magazine." "They didn't tell me more than I needed," Rhett said more quietly now. Only that someone high up wanted the data. Someone inside your company. They said it came from the top. Callan leaned forward slowly. His breath was calm, his voice a whisper. Then this flight wasn't random, he said, eyes locked on Rhett's. Rhett swallowed hard, finally looking him in the eye. The fear was there now, cracking through the armor. It was an inside order. Callan's finger froze on the video timeline the instant the man in the maintenance vest stepped into frame. He leaned forward, heart pounding. The footage wasn't grainy. Revemont's internal cabin feed was government-grade, ultra-high resolution. There was no mistaking the badge clipped to the vest, the casual gait, or the slight tilt of the head as the man moved with confidence through first class. His gloved hand reached toward the service rack by the galley, and with practiced ease, he slipped a thin, curved metal hanger between the folded linens and backup supplies. The badge read, R. Darvin. Callan's breath left him in a shallow gasp. Ryland Darvin, head of logistics at Varentech Industries, his own employee, trusted for 8 years. He'd approved Darvin's promotion personally. Now, here he was, planting what would become a weapon used to humiliate and nearly incapacitate him mid-flight. A dull ache tightened at the base of Callan's skull. His jaw still throbbed from where Rhett Hadron had jammed that same hanger into his mouth. But this, the video, this rewrote everything. The attack hadn't been improvisational. It had been planned, staged, supplied from the inside. The door hissed open behind him. Agent Riventarl stepped into the darkened console room, the glow from the screen painting his face in flickering blue light. "You said you had something?" Callan didn't turn. He hit play again, gesturing toward the footage. "There. Watch closely." Right before boarding, Tarl approached, arms folded, studying the screen. The figure on the monitor moved with subtle purpose, not hurried, but not aimless either. His fingers barely hesitated as they placed the hanger and adjusted the cloth around it, almost like nesting a tool within a toolbox. Then he turned, disappeared from frame. Tarl frowned. "Who is he?" "Ryland Darvin," Callan replied, his voice flat. "My logistics director. He oversees every shipment of prototype components, including those related to Project Auric." Tarl straightened, eyes narrowing. "If he's compromised." "Then our entire network is," Callan finished. "Access routes, supply chains, encryption nodes, all of it." A long silence settled between them. Outside the sealed chamber, the soft hum of servers pulsed like a heartbeat. Tarl finally spoke. "This isn't conclusive. He didn't touch you. He didn't assault anyone. He placed something on a rack." Callan turned, his gaze hard. "He placed the weapon." "But not in your mouth," Tarl replied, cautious but firm. "Legally, that distinction matters." Callan stared at him, then slowly sank into the chair. His mind was moving faster than his body. Every puzzle piece, the timing, the placement, Rhett's comments, Maller's transmission device, it all pointed to internal collaboration. But a courtroom needed more than intuition and inference. "Then we make him give us more," Callan said quietly. Tarl tilted his head. "How?" Callan leaned back and stared at the blinking cursor of the console's secure interface. His fingers hovered above the keys. "We give him a reason to move. Something too good to ignore." The idea struck with sudden clarity. He began typing. "What are you doing?" Tarl asked. "Triggering him." Within seconds, a message rippled out from Varentech's private encrypted server, a press bulletin marked confidential but deliberately vulnerable to passive interception. The headline was direct. "Varentech CEO Callan Dray cleared of all charges. Federal oversight greenlights new defense contract signing, 0900 hours tomorrow." Callan paused, then added a subheading. "Senior R and debriefings to include finalized Auric Drive encryption packet." He hit send. The message vanished into the net of comms nodes, routed through Varentech's own cloud before bouncing across federal relay points. Darvin would see it, or someone close to him would. Either way, if he was the leak, he would be compelled to act. Tarl raised an eyebrow. That'll stir some birds. Let them fly, Callan muttered. He won't resist that bait. He stood, jaw still bruised, spine rigid with controlled tension. Darvin thinks I'm back in my office, rebuilding reputation. He won't expect surveillance. He won't expect me to walk in with a federal agent pretending to be counsel. He'll feel safe. He'll reach for something, an update, a sync, a relay node, and when he does, we grab him by the hand he reaches with, Tarl finished. Callan nodded slowly. Outside, the Rievemont tarmac was washed in a blue pre-dawn hue. Cargo trucks moved like silent phantoms beneath floodlights. Inside the steel vault of the console room, the air seemed to tighten, electric with tension, brittle with anticipation. Tarl stared at the screen one last time, then back at Callan. You sure he'll come? Callan didn't blink. If Darvin was the leak, he said, voice low, he wouldn't resist taking that bait. Sometimes the best trap, Callan told Tarl, is the illusion of safety. The office door clicked shut behind Darvin with a soft thud, sealing him in the conference room that had been scrubbed clean of its usual veneer. Gone were the executive fruit trays and digital waterboards, replaced by silence, by the chill of precision. 2 chairs, 1 table, a tablet blinking softly at its center. The walls hummed faintly, just below the range of conscious thought, lined with temporary acoustic dampeners and signal interceptors. It was no longer his domain. Darvin, dressed in his usual crisp gray suit, ran a hand through his neatly parted hair and gave a tight smile. You're early, he said. The words meant to sound light but wobbling at the edges. Long flight? Across the table, Callan Dre didn't smile back. His posture was impeccable, spine straight, shoulders firm beneath a dark coat that still bore the faint wrinkles of travel. A bruise was blooming along his jawline, but his eyes, clear, sharp, and unblinking, carried the weight of resolve. Beside him stood Agent Riven Tarl, now disguised as legal counsel, briefcase in hand and expression unreadable. Callan's voice cut the air cleanly. Longer than you'll ever know. Darvin chuckled weakly, fingers adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. Well, let's not waste more time then. He pulled the chair back and sat, the sound of metal legs scraping tile echoing too loudly in the room. A clipboard was slid across to him, contracts, a decoy, but real enough to mask their purpose. The signature pen rested beside it, innocuous, standard issue, except it wasn't. As Darvin began signing, the pen's microchip activated silently, syncing with the tablet just inches away. Callan's eyes never left the screen. Numbers flickered across the encrypted interface, packet traces, IP logs, external server pings. One term blinked again and again. Malor 9. Coordinates followed. Callan felt a cold surge rise through his spine. An abandoned airfield, south of the city, unregistered on commercial maps. Tarl, standing just behind Darvin, shifted slightly, the faintest movement signaling that he'd seen it too. The silent trap was closing. Darvin's hand hesitated mid-signature. He caught the twitch at the corner of Callan's mouth, a half-formed smile, the kind a predator makes when the prey stumbles into the open. "What did you do?" Darvin asked, voice strained, eyes darting to the tablet. Callan stood slowly, his palms resting on the edge of the table, leaning in just enough to cast a shadow over the document. "You uploaded your own confession," he said evenly. Darvin's breath caught. The door opened without a knock. 2 internal security officers stepped in, flanking the doorway like sentinels. Behind them, Varentech's head of security, a stern man named Halvin, gave a single nod. The room's energy shifted. The illusion of safety shattered. Darvin jolted to his feet, stumbling back. "You think they'll stop with me?" he shouted, eyes wide and voice rising into a near-hysterical pitch. "You think this ends here?" The real contracts above us all. Callan didn't move. He didn't flinch. He watched. "You don't understand," Darvin cried, backing into the wall. "This isn't just business, it's ownership. Global scale. You think shutting down one flight will change it?" "On the contrary," Callan said, his voice almost calm. "I think it already has." Tarl gave a signal. The guards moved. One took Darvin by the arm, another secured the tablet and pen. "You're making a mistake," Darvin growled. "You don't know who's really pulling this." "We will," Tarl replied. "Sooner than you think." As Darvin was dragged past him, Callan leaned slightly closer, his tone lower than ever, meant for no one else. "Then we just found the top of the ladder." Outside, as the building trembled with the undercurrent of withheld secrets, clouds gathered over the runway, ominous, heavy, and still. "In the sky," Callan murmured. "Storms don't vanish. They evolve." The unauthorized login attempt hit Callan's console like a silent bullet, direct, untraceable to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to his. A single flicker of data across his encrypted dashboard at 11:42 p.m., and the entire floor beneath him seemed to tilt. The signal bounced once off Varentech's internal relay and then vanished, but not before leaving a signature. Red Vaughn. Callan's breath tightened. He didn't move at first. He simply stared at the glowing timestamp on his terminal, rain crackling softly against the windows behind him. The city below blurred into streaks of light, smeared by the storm that had crept in like a quiet omen. Vaughn, of all people. Varentech's deputy director had always been the ghost in the boardroom, present but never loud, observant yet harmless. A strategist in silence. Now, that silence felt sharpened, weaponized. Callan reached for the encrypted line and called Agent Tarl. "Trace hit at 23:42, Callan said. "Who?" "Vaughn." There was a pause. "You need to hold," Tarl replied, calm but edged. "We're prepping the warrant." No sudden moves. Callan's voice remained even. "He won't stay still for long. Then bait him." But don't confront. Callan ended the call without answering. He didn't believe in waiting. Not when he'd spent the last 72 hours clawing out of betrayal. Darvin's arrest had blown the top off the first layer of conspiracy, but Callan had always known the rot ran deeper. Now it had a name. At dawn, the office lights flickered to life with a pale, clinical glow. The storm had cleared but left behind a thick layer of fog, wrapping the Varentech tower in a cocoon of gray. Vaughn arrived precisely at 7 a.m., dressed in his usual charcoal blazer, his expression unreadable. The only sound in the executive lounge was the gentle hiss of the espresso machine as it filled 2 cups. "I appreciate the invitation," Vaughn said, his voice smooth as polished steel. He took the offered cup and sat down across from Callan with unnerving ease. "It's not every day one gets summoned before sunrise." Callan didn't smile. He didn't even blink. "The damage control team is assembling. You and I needed to speak first." Vaughn sipped his coffee, slow and deliberate. "You made the news heroic, Callan," he said, "but you also made enemies." Callan leaned forward, placing both elbows on the table, his voice steady but cold. "You mean the ones you paid to kill me mid-flight?" The air between them snapped tight like a drawn wire. Vaughn didn't flinch. In fact, he chuckled softly, shaking his head as if amused by a child's guess. "You always had a flair for the dramatic," he said. "But no, Callan, you weren't targeted for theatrics. You were selling too much integrity. It scared the right investors." His tone was casual, but Callan watched closely. Vaughn's left thumb twitched slightly, a reflex of tension. Tarl had taught him to watch hands. Hands told truth when mouths lied. "You signed off on Project Auric," Callan said, voice low. "You lobbied for its independence. You pushed for zero military integration. And you publicized it," Vaughn replied, setting his cup down with a soft clink. You turned ethical restraint into a spectacle. You started telling the world we could fly cleaner, safer, without compromise. That was never the deal. Callan's eyes narrowed. Whose deal? But Vaughn only smiled. A cruel, knowing smile. You should have died quietly at 30,000 feet. The words landed like a knife. Cold, unfeeling, calculated. For a long moment, neither man moved. Outside, the fog peeled slowly away from the glass, revealing a sunless sky lit only by the glow of early morning. The silence inside the room thickened, pressing down like the weight of gravity. Callan didn't look away. And yet, here I am. There was a subtle flicker in Vaughn's gaze, surprise, disappointment. It passed too quickly to name. Callan stood slowly, his shadow stretching long across the conference table. Vaughn remained seated, but the ease in his shoulders began to erode. Callan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth, he said, each word deliberate, flies farther than fear. Vaughn's arrest didn't make headlines at first. It didn't need to. The shockwave it sent through Varentech's top floors was enough to rattle every polished tile, every executive who had once laughed at the idea of oversight. Callan stood in the observation room above the headquarters Central Command floor, his reflection caught in the glass like a double of the man he used to be. Below, federal agents swept through servers and secure archives, tagging hard drives and collecting evidence. He didn't move, didn't blink, as Agent Tarl approached from behind. They confirmed it, Tarl said quietly, setting down a tablet. The server Mallard transmitted to, registered under a company called Orvin Dynamics. Vaughn's name is buried 6 layers deep in the corporate trail. Callan exhaled through his nose, his hands clasped behind his back. The betrayal was bitter, but not surprising. He thought he was smarter than the system, Callan murmured, so he built his own. Tarl nodded grimly, and he almost got away with it. Hours later, under the floodlights of a pressurized hearing room inside a federal facility, Callan took a seat behind the witness table. Cameras buzzed softly from the corners. The prosecutor, a stern man with steel-gray hair, addressed the room. "Mr. Dre, please recount the events that occurred aboard Flight 904. Callan's voice was calm, steady, each word deliberate. "I was seated in 1A. I was reviewing proprietary files on Project Auric, which remained encrypted on a secure tablet. The flight attendant, Rhett Hadron, initiated a physical assault using a metal hanger. I subdued the threat. However, the assault wasn't random." He paused. Flashbulbs clicked from behind the courtroom glass. He let the silence stretch, then continued. "The passenger across from me, Grant Maller, was equipped with microtransmission devices concealed in his cufflinks. He was not a civilian. He was extracting classified visuals from my screen during the chaos. The entire incident was a staged attempt to eliminate me mid-flight and discredit Varentech's internal reform trajectory." The room was hushed, every word weighed like evidence. The prosecutor gestured to the table. "Is that the hanger?" A gloved officer placed it on the stand. Callan didn't look at it. "Yes," he said simply, but it was never about the hanger. Next came Rhett, escorted into the witness box. Thinner now, his posture hunched. He refused to look at Callan as he sat, his face pale. He gripped the microphone with both hands and swallowed hard. "They told me he was dangerous," Rhett said, "that his decisions were going to get people killed, that he was selling out the company. Vaughn said, if I humiliated him, he'd back down." "Lose credibility," the courtroom murmured. Rhett's voice trembled. "I was told, make it look like arrogance got him hurt." Those were Vaughn's words. Callan's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was beginning to speak for itself. Outside, as the hearing concluded and reporters swarmed the exit, Callan stepped into the camera's blinding halo. Microphones stretched forward. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Dre, how does it feel to survive a corporate hit job?" Callan didn't blink. "This wasn't about a man's pride," he said, voice firm. "It was about the belief that integrity is expendable." Gasps rippled through the press pool, followed by silence. That single sentence hit harder than any headline. Back inside the building, a quiet invitation waited for him. A sealed letter bearing the government's seal. Inside, an offer, chairman of the Ethics Oversight Committee for Defense Contractors. Full authority, independent jurisdiction. It was a role that would put him at the helm of national ethical compliance, with the power to reshape how technology and power intermingled. Callan stared at the letter for a long time. His reflection shimmered in the surface of the nearby window. "Reform isn't just policy," he whispered. "It's a declaration." He accepted the role, but not without one condition. Varentech would never again develop military technology. When he made the announcement at the next press conference, gasps filled the room. Investors panicked. Advisors raged. But Callan didn't flinch. "We will build engines for peace, not war," he declared. "Let the world say we stopped when it mattered." Later that week, protesters held banners that read, "Integrity is the new defense." Media outlets called him arrogant, idealistic, naive, but millions disagreed. Students sent letters of admiration. Whistleblowers reached out, inspired. And in cities across the country, engineers held quiet gatherings under one phrase, "Lumen begins." Vaughn had planned to kill a movement. Instead, he ignited one. As Callan stepped onto the stage for a live press briefing, cameras broadcasting nationwide, he took no notes, read no script. His tie was simple. His collar still bore the faint shadow of the bruise from the hangar. He looked into the cameras, not past them. "Sometimes," Callan said at the press briefing, "the best revenge is revolution." Callan Dre turned the hanger over slowly in his gloved hands, the overhead skylight casting soft reflections across its twisted, metallic surface. The once crude weapon, shoved violently into his mouth at 30,000 feet, now looked almost elegant in its preserved form, its frame looped into something that resembled an infinity symbol. The sharp edges had been cleaned, the metal polished, but the shape remained as it had been after that moment of instinctive defense, bent, locked, and unwilling to yield. Agent Riven Tarl stood beside him in the quiet gallery of the Lumen Institute, a space newly converted from what used to be Varentech's classified research floor. Gone were the armored doors, biometric locks, and surveillance nodes. In their place, glass walls let in sunlight and open air. A group of young engineers across the hall were engaged in assembling lightweight drone frameworks, each powered by the Auric Drive solar compression cell that had nearly cost Callan his life. The low hum of their careful work filled the space, steady as a heartbeat. "Evidence officially closed," Tarl said, holding out the sealed case the hangar had been delivered in. Callan gave a small nod, not taking his eyes off the artifact in his hands. "Didn't think I'd ever see it again," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of that memory, of Rhett's sudden lunge, the pain, the humiliation, the taste of blood, and the surge of calculated fury that had turned a weapon meant to silence him into a symbol of defiance. "It's been cleared for archival," Tarl added. "Technically, we could store it in federal evidence lockers, but I figured you'd want to decide." Callan's fingers tightened slightly around the metal. "I do," he said. "I want it where others can see it, not for what it was, but for what it became." They walked together toward the center of the open atrium, where a pedestal of reinforced glass stood beneath the dome. Sunlight streamed through the lattice above, catching flecks of dust in the air, making it feel as though the entire space pulsed with clarity. Callan opened the pedestal's casing, gently set the hanger inside, and stepped back. As he locked the cover and stepped away, his eyes caught the freshly inscribed plaque beneath the display. "Restraint forged by resolve." Below that, a smaller line read, "When integrity is attacked, innovation answers." For a moment, Callan just stood there, motionless. He looked smaller beneath the vast dome, his posture still rigid from months of stress that had never fully left his frame. The past wouldn't loosen its grip easily, but here, under the soft light, in this new space, he felt it begin to ease. Not disappear, just shift. Tarl watched him quietly before speaking again. Rhett's testimony helped close the final link. Vaughn's trial ends next week. He's not contesting it anymore. Callan nodded once. He knows the chain's too tight. A pause. And Rhett? In witness protection. New name, new location. He'll never work aviation again. He shouldn't, Colin said, his tone firm but not cruel. But he gave us the truth. That counts for something. Tarl glanced toward the young engineers still working in the far end of the room. And them? You think they know the whole story? No, Callan replied. They don't need to. They'll carry the mission forward without the ghosts that built it. The moment lingered in stillness, the only sound the faint shifting of glass above them. Outside the dome, gray clouds gathered in the sky, thick with the promise of late spring rain. Callan stared through the glass, watching them roll across the heavens. A familiar pressure settled in his chest, not fear, not grief, but a sense of responsibility that had grown heavier ever since he chose not to retaliate through vengeance, but through change. I keep thinking, Callan said after a while, his voice softer, more distant, about how easy it would have been to respond with destruction. Fire them, silence them, sue them all. Tarl's brow furrowed. But you didn't. No, Callan replied, because if I did, they'd have won. I'd become the image they painted, arrogant, entitled, reckless. But this, he gestured toward the hangar, encased like a relic, this says I survived without becoming like them. Tarl gave a faint smile. You know, not every man could have done that. Callan didn't smile in return. He turned his attention back to the hangar, now gleaming under the atrium lights. I didn't do it alone, he said. You believed me. Cale stood up. Even Rhett broke when it mattered. Still, Tarl said, you turned a company that nearly destroyed you into a place that might outlast you. Not might, Callan said. Will. The light shifted as the clouds briefly parted. A beam of sunlight pierced through, striking the hangar inside the glass. It shone, refracting a prism of color along the floor. Across the hall, one of the young engineers let out a short laugh, having finally solved a calibration issue in his drone. His partner gave him a thumbs up, and the two leaned closer to the solar cell, examining the readouts. Callan watched them for a long time, then exhaled. Slowly, purposefully. Then so will I, he said quietly. Only in the open. As the clouds above shifted once more and the hum of the lab continued around them, he stepped away from the display, his posture lighter, his steps more even. His eyes lingered on the horizon beyond the glass, as if looking toward something still unseen, still rising. Somewhere above, the sky rumbled faintly with the coming rain, and beneath the hangar's pedestal, the final words waited, untouched by time. Some flights never end, he whispered. They just find new skies. He tried to embarrass a leader, and moments later stood speechless when the CEO revealed his name. If you believe dignity always wins, subscribe now, because real power never raises its voice. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, power, and poetic justice in the face of discrimination. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on dignity, equality, and standing up to prejudice.